Welcome to Spiritual Studies Session 22. This is on Pythagoras, Pythagoreanism, sacred geometry, Pythagoras's relationship with the occult, and a lot of other strange things too, even ancient vegetarianism. So if you're interested in the occult portion of this talk, you will want to skip ahead to the later portion. The general scheme of this talk will be all about Pythagoras at the start, his life, who he was, some of the associations with the beliefs of Pythagoras. Then later we're going to be moving on to his effects on the world as it outstretches, and different influences on different ideologies and so forth. And then lastly, I'm going to focus on the occult and Pythagoras's relationship with sacred geometry. So we begin with saying that Pythagoras and, interestingly enough, Buddha and Lao Tzu all are living in the world around the same time. So when I'm bringing up these discussions of what Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans thought of the afterlife, they are very similar to Lao Tzu's beliefs, to Buddha's beliefs, to the Eastern world. Essentially, that being that a soul goes through an endless wheel of incarnations until we purify enough or reach nirvana and return to the divine. Pythagoras was obviously a Greek philosopher, if you want to call it that, a Greek mystic, a Greek visionary. His teachings would influence not only Plato, Aristotle, and Western spirituality, but would set the precedent for science much later into the future. Pythagoras is most well known, and probably if you're just coming in on this topic, in math class, the Pythagorean theorem. As soon as you start getting into geometry, this is the first note, is the Pythagorean theorem. So his name is most touted in common culture when it comes to mathematics. But I want to blow up this right away. They call it the Pythagorean theorem, but he's simply someone who popularized this equation, this formula. You can find this formula back in even like Babylonian tablets, dating anywhere between 1900 to 1600 BC. You could also find similar, or the exact same formula, I should say, in the sutras in India, dated 800 to 400 BC. So as we'll see as a theme throughout Pythagoreanism and Pythagoras, it's not that he is the one coming up with it, it's that he is the kind of catalyst or the trademark of this sort of knowledge. And the other thing that you might know about Pythagoras is this strong fixation on triangles. It's almost an obsession with triangles. This bleeds all across the Western tradition. I don't even need to mention the Christian Trinity, right? In Kabbalism, you have the same kind of understanding of the use of three. This is an ancient trope that even bleeds into things like palmistry. So how do we break up this talk of triangles? Well, first I should point out the, what is it called again? It's the tetractylus. And this tetractylus is a series of 10 dots that together the dots form a larger triangle from each individual point, an equilateral triangle. So to the Pythagoreans, this was encoded with a lot of symbolism. We might look at it now and it seems like a rather cliche math textbook diagram. But if you were to see this dots creating this triangle, the way you'd understand it is the first dot is representing the active principle, or you could even think of it as God, as the Pythagoreans did. And the two dots below it represent the matter being created, or the passive principle, manifestation. The third set of dots, the three dots, would represent the union of active and passive principles, or the chemical marriage between masculinity and femininity in the cosmos. And then proceeding to the fourth, which would represent the liberal arts, the four liberal arts and sciences that would complete the world. So while we might look at this ancient iconography as if it's bland and superficial, we have to understand that the Pythagoreans are a secret society. So much of what we are uncovering, we have to understand what it actually means on their terms, in their context. Other ways that people may know of Pythagoras, or what his name touts, is his knowledge of tuning. If you're a musician, then you understand the history of music. And Pythagoras was one of the first, I can't say the first, to distinguish the different tonal intervals in notes. He also has a theory of proportions. He was also one of the first, if not the first, to claim the spherical nature of the Earth and to measure other planets. The identification of the planet Venus is touted by Pythagoras. So in Middle Age, or the Middle Ages, in the curriculum in university, it was always about the trivium, which is the three roads, or the quadrivium, which is the four roads. And the quadrivium, this curriculum that they used in universities, was the Pythagorean view of the cosmos. So this is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These were the basics that were handed down from Pythagoras onward. And eventually it would give way to Aristotelianism. So Aristotle would kind of take some of the notoriety for a while, but the baseline was always Pythagoras. And this Aristotelianism would get again usurped by Pythagoreanism in the birth of science, or rationality, or rationalism, with Copernicus, with Kepler, with Newton. They all looked back to Pythagoras to reinvent this, or reinvigorate this science-oriented type of mind. However, I say all of this, and all of this is accredited to Pythagoras, but there are no writings that have survived of Pythagoras. It's always what has been told by historians and what was done by the pupils of Pythagoras. So Pythagoras never wrote anything himself, which, by the way, is a great way to turn into a legend in history, is to never write your own work, have everybody write about you. You can see the same with Socrates. You can see the same with Diogenes, or like in a few talks ago, Hermes Trismegistus, but that's a little contentious. So where did Pythagoras get this knowledge? First, we know, based off of history, that he was a pupil to one of the first pre-Socratic philosophers, which is Anaximander. And Anaximander was known for measuring the distance between planets. So he was already working out a sophisticated astronomy, of which Pythagoras would inherit. So in his work of clarifying the planetary sequence from the sun, he was inheriting this knowledge from former teachers. Now, this is a quote directly from Aristotle. It says, "Most people, in fact, who regard the whole heaven as finite, say that it lies at the center," meaning that the earth lies at the center. "But the Italian philosopher known as Pythagoras takes the contrary view. At the center, they say, is fire, the sun, and the earth is one of the stars, creating night and day by its circular motion about its center. So here we're seeing in the ancient world, Pythagoras, and by extension Pythagoreans, believe in heliocentrism. And as we know in history, this would be swept under the rug for a very long time until Kepler and until Copernicus. And you might say that Copernicus was so unique in proposing the heliocentric model, but again, he's taking it back from history. So to continue the talk of how he got this information, Pythagoras traveled to Egypt. He traveled to Babylon. He went to learn, and as I've established before, to the Greeks, Egypt was like the modern day India, where you would go there to learn of the ancient knowledge. You know, people go to India to learn of the chakras and of these old esoteric Hindu scriptures. And that was the same for Pythagoras and all these pre-Socratics going to Egypt. So he was accumulating wisdom in his travels, and being perfectly placed with the right teachers is a very simple way of summing that up. So in his travels to Egypt, a lot of these secret societies that were there at the time in Thebes and so forth were very tight-lipped about their knowledge. And as I've discussed before, there's good reason these secret societies are tight-lipped. But he was said to be the only foreigner ever allowed privilege of taking part in their worship. So he was privy to different initiatory rites of different orders that we don't have names for. And so yet again, it's not that he came up with all this wisdom himself. He's the inheritor of this from other people. So what does this amount to, right? To accumulate the knowledge from not only the Egyptians, the Babylonians, but also for him to be taught arithmetic from the Phoenicians, and the Chaldeans teaching him more about astronomy. I mean, the idea that the earth is spherical alone shows how deep knit he was into the truth of the matter, right? This is something that wouldn't become mainstream for a long time, for generations and generations. He was even privy to the fact of the earth being divided into different climate zones. How would one know of the entire earth in this way, right? So this is to say that all of the greatest minds, or those that were aspiring to become gentlemen or well-learned scholars, would go to visit Pythagoras in his academy. He even dwelled in this secret cave that you could only hear of through like happenstance, where he would have courses and discourses for his close friends and for the few that would learn of him. Eventually, Greece boiled into tyranny, and he had to take off to a place called Croton, which is in Italy, which is why Aristotle called him an Italian philosopher. So Pythagoras, in philosophy, emphasized moderation, piety, respect for elders, and advocated for monogamous family structure. This might seem very plain to us, but to the Greeks, this was a bit countercultural, like sheer monogamous family structure. Yeah, that's true. He was a political reformer from where he lived, and he was in charge of education of the whole city of Croton. So he was very involved with where he lived. These views that Pythagoras had aren't just his accumulation, they're also very similar to a whole other belief system that was happening at the time, which is Orphism. And they both have similar views on reincarnation, or what they called metempsychosis, which means the kind of transmigration of souls. And to kind of give that some breath before I move on, I should cover this whole metempsychosis matter. So the idea here is that the soul and body are united by a compact which is unequal. The soul is viewed as imprisoned within the body. Does this not sound like Buddhism, right? Or does this not sound a lot like Gnosticism? Um, so death dissolves this compact, but the soul will find a new body and is re-imprisoned. And the idea here is to escape the wheel that is uncontrollably throwing you through the loops of time. And so the idea is that the soul goes on a journey alternating between a space of unrestrained existence and reincarnation. So sometimes in, sometimes out, but always on the wheel of necessity. And that this transmigration of the soul happens between men and animals. So unlike Buddhism, it's not a hierarchy system that if you're sinful, you end up in bad animals. It's just to say all animals, all humans are tied together on this animalistic soul loop. And their message of liberation, both the Orphism belief and the Pythagorean belief and the Buddhist belief, all ties to this idea of becoming pure, self-purification, to live the most genuine, authentic life is the way to escape the wheel or to not be reincarnated. And ideally this would have you join, you could say God, you could have you could say join the divine, you could say join the unrestrained fulfillment outside of corporeal existence. So this is you know, the metaphysics as I'm giving it to you. The soul is immortal, it transfers, it's used to bodies, and even Pythagoras would go so far as to say, in this assumption, that humans exist simply to observe the heavens. Now, this seems weird, but to exist is to take study of what existence is. So thus, we exist here to observe the heavens, to observe divinity, to tap in to the real reality that we're all sitting in right now. This led to a lot of astronomical understandings. Pythagoras taught that the seven muses in Greek myth are actually the seven planets singing together. And we'll get into that later. It's called the celestial harmonies, or the, you know, how each planet has a sound, as a belief of the Pythagoreans. So thus, I should sum up this. I don't want to spend too much time on reincarnation. The soul is immortal. You will come into whatever bodies are most fitting to you by necessity, but by paying attention to yourself, by becoming conscientious, you escape. And this is something to be desired. And to exist is not necessarily something to be desired. So thus, you need to work your best to have a healthy body and a healthy psyche. And this balancing act, this act of moderation, is what will release you from existence or corporeal existence. And again, I just want to reiterate, this is not, you know, for what we were taught math class, like Pythagorean theorem, he was a mathematician. This is so much more. And we'll see it gets way weirder than this when we're talking about the esotericism. But so another quote from Aristotle. The so-called Pythagoreans were the first to take up mathematics, not only advanced in this subject, but saturated with it. They fancied the principles of mathematics were the principles of all things. And this is why they call him a mathematician, is because by Pythagoras, mathematics is the mystical nature of reality. To observe the heavens is to observe mathematics, that all things are number. And you can see how this would inspire science later on. but each number has a numerological or symbolic meaning to the Pythagoreans, like I was talking about with the early triangle. I'm trying to remember its name, but you know, how I mentioned that the number 1 is God, the origination of all things, creation. Number 2 represented matter. So this idea of this obsession with a triangle in this form is the symbol of the god Apollo. And it's the kind of like baseline of all reality. And this was the thing to seek, is the baseline. The thing that I didn't mention, though, is that the number 10 is viewed as the perfect number, which this is how it bleeds over into Kabbalism, how there's 10 different realms, 10 different parts of the tetragrammaton. But anyhow, so this obsession with math and this obsession with finding the code or the true teachings of reality was everything to the Pythagoreans. And he would form around him, Pythagoras, a tightly knit community of philosophical enterprising thinkers. And this would be the inspiration for what Plato did. You know, how Plato had this ensemble of philosophers all around him. That was inspired by Pythagoras. So this is also what inspired the idea of the world of forms, or of ideal forms, that there was a nature outside of physical reality that was all number, that it was all a realm of mathematical calculation, geometrics, sacred geometry. So I got real heady right from the beginning here. I want to talk more of the strangeness of who Pythagoras really was. And I'm going to do this by talking about the Pythagorean diet. So the Pythagorean diet, and of which is very enforced upon all the people that would follow him, is abstaining from all meat, yes, fish, and beans. This is where it gets weird. Why beans, right? So beans are not allowed because he believed that humans and beans spawned from the same source. The idea here is that the consistency of a bean is like flesh. And thus it's like cannibalism to eat beans. And this is kind of a trope of ancient Greece in general, but he wanted to prove this. So he buried a bunch of beans in mud and he let them sit there for a few weeks. And then he went to go get them. And he noted that they resembled the form of human fetuses. Thus, we should not eat beans. You know, it's taboo to eat people. Thus, it's taboo to eat beans. So a very strict rule, right? You can't do it. And Greeks also, by extension, believed that eating beans could get a woman pregnant. But anyhow, here's a kind of anecdote, and you can't say these things are true because people would come up with a lot of satire back in the day when they'd make fun of other polemic thinkers, but here's a story. One day, Pythagoras was walking through a field and came up on an ox, and the ox was eating beans in a pasture. And Pythagoras was really upset about this. So he went to the herdsman and he said, "You have to stop this." And the herdsman just laughed at him. You know, it's an ox, who cares? And so Pythagoras was seen going up to the ox and murmuring into its ear for a long time. And the farmer's like, you know, what's up with this? And he talked about it with the locals. He joked about it. But then he came back later and then saw that the ox no longer ate the beans. And in fact, apparently, learned to live until a very old age, past the normal lifespan of an ox. So is this an anecdote? Is it a real story? You know, is Pythagoras whispering to oxes? Who knows, right? But like I mentioned before, the purity of the body was a very strong fixation for Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans. So fostering a healthy body would be your road to excellence, or to your road of purity and ascendance. So in this way, they had to take these things very seriously. The beans, the meat. And while I'm on the topic, the meat thing was that they believed that any being that could experience pain should not be inflicted, like should not be in pain unnecessarily. So to inflict pain upon animals is to inflict pain upon yourself, because again, they believe that we transmigrate into other animals. There's another story that makes fun of Pythagoras, saying that he came upon a man beating a dog, and he went up to the dog crying and said, I know this man, he's an old friend of mine, you can't beat him. Is it allegory or not? But they took that stuff very seriously. So thus, you can't kill the animals because the animals are you, or it could be an old friend of yours. They took that seriously. So thus, you to keep yourself pure, you do not eat meat and you don't eat beans. You need to show the animals justice. So justice can be shown upon you. It's a respectful thing, and you got to give it to them, no matter how seemingly silly it might seem, especially the beans part, right? But if everybody acted in this way of purification, of a balance act, then that kind of force in that display would work itself through the cosmos and would, lo and behold, create utopia for everybody around. So they were kind of holding up the end for everybody else in their mind. They were doing what needed to be done. So it's not that it's self-righteous necessarily, but it's kind of like the Zoroastrians, where they believed that if everybody stopped, that it's very serious that we don't sin, because if we show it and everybody else does it, then utopia comes. So it's not just on the one person, it's on everybody. Okay, now there are many mysterious aspects as to how Pythagoras died. And one story, it's what is known is that Pythagoras rejected a student in his town in his old age because he thought that he was wrong-minded. And this student was actually very influential in the town, was a son of somebody who had a lot of money. His name was Chilon. And since he was rejected by Pythagoras, he influenced a bunch of people to basically create a mob and to destroy the Brotherhood of the Pythagoreans. And they did. They lit it on fire. But Pythagoras somehow escaped. And after this is what's unknown. They know that he escaped and he died soon after. But what the kind of like headcanon is, if we want to like have a certain detail of how his life ended, they allegedly chased him down in a bean field and they stabbed him to death amongst the beans, which is either very ironic or sort of gratifyingly poetic, if you think about it. Anyhow, so getting away from explaining who Pythagoras was, his own quirks and so forth, the Brotherhood of Pythagoras was one that included men and women. So all family members were allowed within the order. So again, I want to state how ahead of the time Pythagoreans were. So you see women studying alongside men in these schools. And with Plato, this wasn't the case. In this way, he was less progressive. Women had to dress up like men to attend Plato's lectures. So not only in the understanding of the heliocentric model, but also in equal rights, Pythagoreans were already there way in the past. So in addition to learning everyday skills, women would be studying philosophy. This is where we get the first female philosophers. And I say first female philosophers because it's very hard to find documentation of female philosophers. You have examples like Hypatia of Alexandria is a good one. But most of the time you could say that Christianity removed a lot of this history. But the ones that we can find are the pre-Socratics. And one of them is, or Pythagoreans, Neo-Pythagoreans. One of them is Theano of Croton, which is the wife of Pythagoras, who is rumored to be the one that took over the Brotherhood after Pythagoras passed And she had a number of writings. You have a number of other philosophers, I guess that's what we should say, that came out of this tradition that did write, and that it's all thanks to the mutual teaching of Pythagoreanism. Now, much like any religion, much like any spirituality after this point, the ideas that started with Pythagoras, or the ideas that were disseminated by Pythagoras, split people. So this split took on two different people. So much like in Christianity, you have different denominations. Literally look at any religion and you see this fracturing that eventually happens after you lose the source of the wisdom. So the first one I'm going to mention are the acousmatikio. And these were the ones, and this word literally translates to the oral saying or the oral preaching, the acousmata. And these were the Pythagoreans that wanted to maintain the philosophical evolution of Pythagoras' teachings. So you can think of them more as the clergy types. And they were less attracted to the mathematical and scientific end of things, the technos, and were more attracted to the aesthetic lifestyle, practicing silence, dressing simply, avoiding meat, and living in a pure way. That's why I say like clergy, like monks. And the other ones were the mathematical kio, which are the ones that split off to do the mathematics in search of the divine, to look into things like musical intervals, numbers, proportions, arithmetic, geometry. And then you leave the others to wonder about the cosmos in a more visionary, mystic sort of sense. So this is where the split happens. And you can see how one is more science-oriented and the other is more theosophy, philosophy-oriented. And ultimately, we know that the mathematical kio would inspire the later scientific revolution many, many centuries after the fact. But also the acousmal kio, the philosophic and the clergies, would be the ones that would inspire the cynics. And as a brief note there, the cynics literally mean dog. Cynic means dog in Greek, and it's all because of Diogenes living like a dog. They would refuse everything that was unnecessary to them. For instance, Diogenes saw his only possession was a cup. He saw a boy drinking from his hands in a river and then got rid of his cup. Minimalism, which the cynics are a whole other subject, but know that was rooted, cynicism is rooted and inspired by Pythagoreanism. And then the mathematical kio people would inspire the Platonic school, the world of forms, and all that Plato would do, and Socrates and all of that. And then lastly, before I get into the kind of esoteric roots in the occultism, you have to talk about the Neo-Pythagoreans, which was a revival of these ideas that Pythagoras gave all those years ago, where they had seemed to become lost in society. They were looking for different answers. They dug up the works of Pythagoras, or everything that was written by Pythagoras, and they brought it back. And this also was influenced by Orphism, as I mentioned before, and the Bacchic cults, which is a whole nother subject. So these believers refined the idea of God. They kind of made some alterations. God in the Pythagorean sense is very, I guess you could say, not very elaborate. And they would make it much more theological. The Neo-Pythagoreans in this way would also change the different ways of spiritual worship of God, which would kind of work the way for Christian monasticism. For instance, they would focus more on abstinence, which wasn't necessarily a thing for the Pythagoreans. So this is where we get that kind of condemnation of masturbation and adulterous behaviors that we see in Christianity later. The inspiration from it came from the Neo-Pythagoreans. And lastly, they focused a lot on the numerology, as I mentioned before, and all the superstitious kind of aspects that came up with Pythagoreanism. For instance, the evil of beings, how some numbers are good and other numbers aren't. And this would mix with the Platonic school in kind of furthering the philosophy as it went into the Middle Ages. Okay. Whew. So that's some kind of real broad history of thoughts, general history of the influence of Pythagoras and Pythagoreanism. Now's where I have to get into the occultism. So the books of Pythagoreanism would eventually be mixed up with what is called the Corpus Hermetica. The Corpus Hermetica is the OG occultism of the Western world. You could say that Hermes and Hermes Trismegistus and Hermeticism came long before this. Regardless, though, Pythagoras was either inspired by or inspired Hermeticism. You see with the Byzantines and their obsession or their use of music and harmonics, they're pulling from the Pythagorean esotericism, the octaves and their effect on the mysticism of the mind in calling forth higher angelic vibes or entities or what have you. As I've mentioned a few times, in the Jewish Kabbalah or Kabbalism, this is the mixed with the Corpus Hermeticum and all topics of OG Western tradition esotericism. And this plays perfectly with Pythagoreanism. You have scholars during this time who are mixed between Kabbalists and Neo-Pythagoreans. So this pool back then is utterly blended. There's no distinction between these two things. It's not to say you're just a Kabbalist or you're just a Pythagorean. And so this fixation with number and numerology was known to both of them. That, you know, the number 1 is the creator and the 7 equals the most divine and the most perfect number. And we see again how Christianity picked this up with this holy number being 7. And I want to note right here, if you want to understand all the different numerical values that are put into the Bible, you know, you have a quote and it's saying things, and all of a sudden it says like this many stones, this many arches. All of those numbers bleed back to esoteric symbolism as it was popularized by Pythagoreanism or Kabbalism as they were mixed. So if you want to understand the code underneath the Bible in this way, you have to understand the numerology of the ancient past. So as I've mentioned a few times, this fixation with music and how it was a religious, spiritual affair. The idea is that if everything is in harmony, if you have just the right pitch, you can unify the multifarious composition of unlike spirits. What does this mean? It's just like in Hermeticism with the law of opposites, how the opposites necessitate each other. And if you are to reach harmony, the balance point between opposites, this will bring about enlightenment, utopia, or the most ideal of all forms in existence. So this applied to mathematics. To get the perfect tone, to get the perfect numbers is harmony. This applied medically to people. So to get the perfect harmony in a person, the perfect balance means they will be in perfect health. This applied to your mind. So it also applies to psychology. To get the perfect balance, if you're too far this way, no good. If you're too acidic, right, we need more alkaline. to get the perfect moderation. Middle point is the harmony. Your mind is then healthy. And this applied to aestheticism. You know, you can eat, but not eat too much, right? Middle ground. And this applied to all manner of metaphysical and cosmological problems. So in perceiving literally everything about the universe, you think about the numbers, or more accurately, you think about the music of it all. Where is the harmony? Where is the tone? If we're turning a dial of the radio, you know, there's a lot of fuzz. So you want to get that dial just right so that the channel comes through clear. This is the way to approach everything. And this is a kind of core to not only Pythagoras, but esotericism in general. So your task in life is to find the harmonious interplay of opposite pairs. And, you know, take that however you will. So the other notes on esotericism here is that in the Pythagorean Brotherhood, you had this entrance leading to a small pool where initiates would clean themselves or purify themselves. And this building was designed according to all manner of Pythagorean numerology. Each table had a number of 7 seats. There were 3 aisles leading to an altar, symbolizing the 3 parts of the soul merging into one, and thus the unity of Apollo, like I mentioned before, in the Trinity. This has everything to do with Freemasonry. You see, still yet in this day, you go to the Washington, D.C., and all the monuments that were built by the Freemasons. They pay attention to the exact number of bricks in the building. They pay attention to the number of stairs that you walk up. These things are all intentional. And in this way, you find this root right here with numerology and Pythagoras. So the Freemasons have clear inspiration from this moment in history that I'm talking about. And in this same way, the Brotherhood had 3 circles of initiation. You had the outer circle, or the exoteric, which were people that lived in their own houses but would study at the institute. Then you had the second inner circle. You started the inner order, and these people had no possessions, and they were required to be vegetarians, and they lived within the society. And then you had the last tier, the true esoteric, the secret knowledge, the middle, right? The 33rd degree. And this was the electi, or what would later call the elite, right? And these were the spiritual, of all spiritual types, you know, of all the disciplines. So to sum up that, reality is mathematical in nature, and a seeking of harmony, the understanding of harmony, is the understanding of all things. The earth is round, as was touted and always known by esotericism. The soul is immortal, and it will change from body to body to body, and it's in union with the divine and seeks to return to the celestial harmony. And lastly, when it comes to this occultism, the notes on alchemy and hermeticism is that the hermetic seal, the symbol for the ether, for the quintessence, is hearkening back to Pythagorean symbolism. So you have the circle within the square, within a triangle, within a circle. This is an emblem or a symbol for the material body, the soul, the spirit. This is a symbol for the alchemical transformation. This is said many times over in different alchemical texts, and this symbol represents the philosopher's stone, or enlightenment. I mean, it's all so clear. So, how can I wrap this up a little bit more succinctly? To give some exact quotes, things that people said that Pythagoras said. Thought is an idea in transit, which when once is released, never can be lured back, nor can the spoken word be recalled, nor ever can the overt act be erased. All that thou thinkest, sayest, doest, bears perpetual record of itself, enduring for eternity. Here is a direct reference to the Akashic records, esotericism. Man, know thyself. Then thou shalt know the universe and God. Know thyself is on the altar of Delphi, where the oracles were. Esotericism. Concern should drive us into action and not into depression. No man is free who cannot control himself. This is, again, hearkening perfectly to Hermeticism. Hermeticism is about the idea of understanding and controlling the opposites, the mood swings that move through you as a person. Know thyself, and you shall know it all. He emphasizes that if you are to do any good in the world, you do it now. You do it today. You don't do it later. So there's an emphasis on now-centricism. The idea of the later scheme of things is that Pythagoras said that evil will destroy itself. That if people keep growing consciously, evil will destroy itself. That virtue is harmony. So the ultimate goal of society is to reach harmony with nature. Not to impose upon it, not to rip away from it, but to join it and to become harmonious. Another quote, just to get back to the vegetarianism: for as long as men massacre animals, they will kill each other. And while this might seem that it plays into the triviality or the superstitiousness of Pythagoreanism, the idea here is that if people are willing to kill animals for taking things from them, then they will be willing to kill each other. It fosters the violent, cruel, unempathic mentality of man. To show compassion and respect for them is to show compassion and respect for ourselves. So you might not be into the whole reincarnation thing, but there's an element of truth to this, a very real truth to this. Respect all things. So when I mentioned before that the soul is split into three and that the Trinity means the unification of the soul or the unification of Apollo, this split in the soul is intelligence, reason, and passion. These are thought of three different facets of the soul: intelligence, reason, and passion, all distinct. Intelligence would be wisdom, reason would be logic, and passion would be fervor or compassion or altruism, the want to improve. So truth in this way is what is most sought and what would bring perfection, thus the obsession with mathematics and mysticism. Truth is what would set us free. Pythagoras is said to have said that if God would render himself visible to man, he would choose to embody himself as light and truth. Interesting, right? Now, in all this esotericism, if you want to understand Hermeticism, if you want to understand Hermes Trismegistus, if you want to understand what the Rosicrucians, the Golden Order, or the Order of the Golden Dawn, if you want to understand the mentality of the modern day occultists, if you're into that, if you want to understand the secret schools of the past, look no further than the philosophies of Pythagoreanism. It is a direct translation of Hermeticism. All these things include Kabbalism too. So this is where your treasure trove is. I take it that if you're in this far into the talk, then you are seeking an element of understanding the ancient tradition and secret schools, or at least you're curious about it. Well, this is what I'm saying. Look no further than these three names: Pythagoras, sacred geometry by extension, Hermeticism, and Kabbalism. So as a kind of outro to all of this, the influence to last note. Leonardo da Vinci's drawing of the, I think it's the Vesuvian Man, is a direct representation of him learning the geometry of Pythagoreanism, sacred geometry. The square, the circle, it's all symbolic, representing the merging of the divine and the earthly nature within man. This is kind of the human enterprise to begin with, is merging, like the mind can conceive the divine, but the earthly world seems below that. So the idea of integrating the divine with the earthly world is the ultimate seeking of humankind. And in this way, it all bleeds into the sacred geometry of things, which has been carried on much further than Pythagoras. So a way of seeing this is how mathematical principles are interlaced throughout manifestation. So a nautilus, a shell. This is the Fibonacci sequence. Okay, sacred geometry. How this Fibonacci sequence can be found in a shell and how it can be found in a spiraling galaxy. Why do honeybees construct hexagonal cells to hold their honey? And where do you find this physical shape elsewhere in nature? This is the mentality of sacred geometry. Why hexagonal? Why 5? And you want to pay attention to that because the number means something, right? What's it say about the universe? Why is it choosing that? This is kind of the mentality of the natural sciences of the ancient world. And so in this way, the geometry that we see in the world has sacred meanings. The proportions are sacred, and that this is all an extension of God in some way, speaking through the numbers, speaking through the formula that spells itself into reality. And we find this in all sorts of mosques, temples, tabernacles, altars, monuments, all across the world, religious art. You find this sacred geometry. They're paying attention to it because it was a part of the natural sciences, the understanding of reality as it unfolds to people. It's not an accident that those bees put it into a hexagonal shape. It's not an accident that the nautilus has this kind of shell. And you find this well beyond the Western world. You find it in the mandalas of Hinduism in India. So all of this information through mathematics and so forth would be stripped of its mysticism, because to the Pythagoreans, the mathematics were spiritual. But in the scientific revolution, they just stuck with the mathematics. Early on with Kepler, with Galileo, with Descartes and Newton, you see a slow dwindling in a letting go of the mysticism that came along with mathematics. And nowadays, you have just math class. There's no philosophy that goes in math class. It's just numbers and the formula. They don't tell you what the numbers mean, right? What they're symbolic for. That's all gone. It's just math. So they left that. That's the part of the Renaissance that we need to bring back in a way. That mathematics is not this dry topic that's alone in itself. And you should stoke the interest of mathematics with its original source, which is an understanding of the very fabric of reality. I'm sure kids would be much more into it if you made that very apparent to them, right? Because that is what it's rooted in. And so, whatever you want to give credit to, whether it's Kepler and his study of the harmonics mundi, or Leibniz's pre-established harmony, or even Albert Einstein speaking of the pre-established harmony. This is all a reference back to the sacredness of mathematics and the sacredness of how it plays into harmony. So the initial harmony of the universe is the ether, as I've mentioned before, is the quintessence, is the pre-cosmos. And the idea is to seek that level of fulfillment and understanding again through studying the natural sciences. Math is not something that's by itself. If you involve it with philosophy, metaphysics, and yes, even esotericism, then you start to see how it spells out across the board of our reality. To isolate reality into just understanding it through math is reductionist and categorical. We need to include it in the greater pool of its discipline, which again involves much more than just the numbers. So, in summation, Pythagoras was a lot more than somebody who's going to simply pass down the theorem, the Pythagorean theorem. To study means that you have to go back to the inspiration of the philosophers of Greece and all that they inspired. The inspiration of, yes, even vegetarianism, the inspiration of the esoteric occultism movement across the Western world, how his beliefs are tied to the Eastern world, and how this implies that there was a central knowing amongst humanity that lives in esotericism. That regardless of all the religions and the deviations that we've seen throughout history when it comes to what we think about reality and the world, it is centered in this esotericism, which you can find in Pythagorean thinking. Whoa. So with that, I'm going to come to a close and ask that you take this all in its truest